Welcome to this video on the top 10 werewolves of the Bone Gnawers tribe. The Bone Gnawers had the distinction of being the most numerous, the most egalitarian, and the most scorned tribe in the Garou nation. The Bone Gnawers survive off of the leavings of others, both Garou and men. They gnaw at the bones and the cartilage and the gristle that nobody else wants. Regardless of this, they not only survive, but they prosper. Their tribal totem, Rat, is a totem of war, but Rat's way is not to gloriously charge into battle in perfect, orderly lines. Instead, the Bone Gnawers bide their time, hide in among the masses, and pick their moment to strike. But without further ado, the top 10 werewolves of the Bone Gnawers. Number 10. Corazon Bitefinder. The sea is a fickle mistress, as any sailor will tell you. She is as likely to slay those who love her as spare those who curse her. A Portuguese bone gnawer of the 15th and 16th centuries by the name of Corazon Bitefinder was beloved by the sea, though she had an unusual way of showing it. It started from childhood, when Corazon's mother tried to drown him at birth. When his father found him, the infant boy gasped back to life. It was to be the first of many such times when the sea refused to take his life. Corazon's father, a fisherman, often took the boy with him into the water. Corazon would sing strange songs that made no sense, but when he did, fish practically swam right into their nets, and even jumped into their boat to the point of nearly capsizing it. Corazon's mother was less delighted by this talent than his father, and in her growing mania insisted that the boy was a witch, or that she had been seduced by an incubus in the night. Unbeknownst to her, she was a kinfolk, and had passed the Garou trait to her son. By the age of 14, Corazon had had enough of his mother's abuse and ran away from home to Lisbon to sign on with one of the many merchant ships. But the ship he signed on with met with disaster and sank. Yet, the sea deposited Corazon safely ashore, waterlogged but still alive. Every ship he tried to board met with the same fate. On his 5th try, Corazon underwent the first change, an event that caused the death of nearly the entire crew. Corazon was later discovered by a kinfetch and inducted into the Bone Gnawers tribe. The Bone Gnawer elders forbade him from setting sail again, and commanded him to use his talents to catch fish for the poor and needy of Lisbon. In 1540, the Great Piping called bone gnawers from across Europe to Portugal. They were aware that the other creatures of the world of darkness were eager to exploit the newly found Americas and were desperate for volunteers to explore the new world. Corazon Bitefinder stood up and insisted that he would scout out the new world, a declaration met with uproarious laughter, given his reputation for sinking nearly every ship he set foot on. But Corazon was determined to break whatever curse had been laid upon him, and he was supported by a group of Bone Gnawers sailors who were eager to win glory for themselves. So, they snuck aboard a ship and set out. The crossing was a miserable one for Corazon, and the Gnawers sustained themselves on a diet of stewed wood, oakum, and discarded fish parts. One night, Corazon went up on deck to look out on the sea. He stepped sideways to look at the ocean from the umbra and raise his flagging morale. But when he did, he finally saw the enemy that had dogged him for his entire life and denied him his adventures, a monstrous, tentacled worm beast that was preparing even then to pull the ship down into the depths. Corazon called for his pack, and the Bone Gnawers engaged in an epic battle against the monster. It was a truly swashbuckling struggle that ended with Corazon shifting into Krynos form, diving into the sea, and plunging the ship's anchor into the creature's heart. 2 years later, Corazon Bitefinder returned to Portugal with tales of the New World and its vast, unclaimed wildernesses. As one galliard put it, if Bitefinder could survive the journey to America, anyone could. By the time Corazon died, he had led nearly 100 bone gnawers from Europe to the New World, and laid the foundation for the tribe in America. Number 9. Henri Eau-de-Fleur. Henri had the misfortune of being born a Metis in Paris, France, one who had no idea as to his ancestry or lineage. What's more, his Metis deformity emerged as a powerful and unpleasant smell that always preceded him and lingered long after he was gone. This made it nearly impossible for him to move stealthily and guard the cairns, as was usually done with Metis at the time. The only tribe that would give sanctuary to someone like Henri was the Bone Gnawers, and even they had to come up with something unusual to do with such an unusual Garou. They trained him to patrol the sewers, a hazardous task for any Garou, much less a Garou operating alone. But Henri was uniquely suited to this task, as his own smell had made him quite nose-blind to the worst odors of Paris's sewers. The first subterranean monsters he encountered were the gamine ratkin, the plague of rat shifters native to Europe. Their women in particular found Henri's fate amusing, and taunted him with gifts of flowers and perfume. Henri answered these mocking romantic overtures by spraying even fouler-smelling urine all over them. Eventually, Henri became so stealthy that he could follow the ratkin unnoticed back to their lairs. When he learned of the mother rat's plot against the surface dwellers, he saw a rare opportunity, both for himself and his tribe. Henri's friendship with the disgusting but attentive spirits of the sewers taught him how to better conceal himself, and then how to better intrude upon the other denizens of Paris's tunnels, the Nosferatu, who looked as bad as Henri smelled. From there he pieced together a feud between the Nosferatu, the aristocratic Ventru, and the effete Toreador. Henri carefully conceived of a plan to drive the Nosferatu and Ratkin into conflict with each other, and he was aided in this by several Garou packs. After the Ratkin and Nosferatu were sufficiently bled, Henri came in and played the peacemaker, suggesting an alliance against the Ventru and Toreador, who controlled France from behind the veil of the aristocracy. The Ratkin and Nosferatu were leery of this arrangement, but even more leery of the sudden display of Bone Gnawer strength. One day, in the spring of 1789, the wolves, the rats, and the lepers burst forth from Paris's crypts and sewers to tear down the Ventru and Toreador lords of Paris. After a month of fighting, the vampires had either fled the city or gone into hiding. Then, in August, without the support of their nocturnal lords, the First and Second Estates were brought low by the Third, in the tide of the French Revolution. Number 8. Auntie Mame. Speaking of French bone gnawers, another was Auntie Mame, possibly the prettiest and cleanest bone gnawer in the history of the tribe. She migrated from France to Charleston, South Carolina, where she set up shop for herself in the world's oldest trade. Pretty soon, she had enough money to buy a boarding house, which she promptly converted into a brothel. When she heard that there was to be war between the colonies and Britain, she took up the cause of the American Revolution by hiding guns and spies in her basement, as well as passing along any useful information some redcoat might have mentioned while he was deep in a cup or consumed by passion. After the Revolution, Auntie Mame expanded and connected 3 townhouses in downtown Charleston, which later became affectionately known by the locals as the Rabbit Ranch. She also installed a number of tunnels, secret doors, false doors, and sliding panels throughout the property. Only Mame's girls knew that the doors and passageways existed, but only Mame herself knew them all like the back of her hand. She was also as open-handed as any bone gnawer could hope to be. Once, she fed Thanksgiving dinner to 100 of her tribe in her basement. She even set up a charitable trust to feed the hungry children in Charleston, a trust which continues in operation in the modern nights. Auntie Mame lived to see her adopted country descend into civil war, and once again chose a side to stand on. She spied for the Union during the conflict. Afterwards, though Charleston was spared from General Sherman's total war, the people of Charleston turned against Mame, ran her out of town, and tore down Rabbit Ranch. She died sometime in the late 19th century in Chicago, Illinois, broken-hearted and destitute. Number 7. Mrs. Preston. History occasionally turns upon the right word in the right ear at the right time. One Bone Gnawer who had the ear of 3 U.S. presidents was Mrs. Preston, a White House orderly and grandmother of the Bone Gnawers of Washington, D.C. She first entered the White House during the Hoover administration. When Franklin Roosevelt was elected, she suggested something akin to the Works Progress administration to President Roosevelt and Secretary of Commerce Harry Hopkins, along with other projects to try and pull the country out of the Great Depression. When the United States entered World War II, Mrs. Preston, after coordinating with the Garou of Europe who were fighting the Axis nations, made a few helpful suggestions about where the Germans' Atlantic wall was the weakest, greatly aiding Operation Overlord, the 1944 invasion of Normandy. When Roosevelt died and the conclusion of the war was left to his vice president, Harry Truman, she tried to dissuade him from using atomic bombs against Japan. It didn't work. But how did this seemingly harmless little lady and lifelong resident of the capital manage to bend the ear of 3 presidents? Well, she was always the kindly sister and aunt, who was full of gossip, especially about goings-on on the Hill. Representative so-and-so was considering this, and Senator so-and-so wouldn't support one bill, but would support another if he got his own bill passed that was beneficial to his state, and so on. And always, this information came from a friend of a friend. During her career, Mrs. Preston never attended a moot, as she was afraid of leading the FBI to the Garou and exposing them to attack. And the FBI did have a file on Mrs. Preston. She retired from government service in 1954 and stayed in her townhouse in Georgetown. 18 years later, in 1972, following the death of J. Edgar Hoover, Mrs. Preston attended her first moot. 20 years later, in the 1990s, though she hadn't been in the White House for nearly half a century, a letter from Mrs. Preston could still get quite a bit accomplished in the executive branch. Number 6. Scratches-at-Fleas. Scratches-at-Fleas is one of the rare lupus of the Bone Gnawers tribe. As an Australian Bone Gnawer, he is a strange mixture of wolf, dog, and dingo. His early life found him scavenging through rubbish bins and dumpsters behind restaurants and sharing his scraps with the smaller, weaker dogs of his pack. When the dog catcher would come around, Scratches-at-Fleas would always be the one to hold the long-armed humans at bay until everyone else escaped. One day, during a fight with a fat dog catcher, Scratches felt rage bubble up inside of him, like a spring breaking through the ground for the first time. He didn't understand what was happening, but somehow, he became taller than the human, and he was standing on his hind legs. With one swat of his paw, he knocked the dog catcher a few yards away. With another swipe, he opened the dog catcher's truck and freed his packmates from inside. Scratches-at-Fleas was later initiated into the Bone Gnawers tribe and joined the Sept of the Mother and the Sacred King. He takes special care of those humans and dogs that cannot defend themselves, especially the homeless, prostitutes, the mentally ill, and derelicts. He will bring them food or protect them from gangsters, pimps, and even the police. Scratches-at-Fleas got his name from his habit of often, and absent-mindedly, scratching himself for fleas, regardless of what form he's in. As a lupus, it's not quite as noticeable, but when a short, stocky, 20-something man with sandy hair, big eyes, and a wide grin does it, it's a unusual tick. Scratches-at-Fleas is one of his Sept's best warriors and has been responsible for the liberation of Garou cubs from Australia's hospitals, prisons, and asylums, sometimes by battle, but more often by trickery. In his Hamid form, he typically disguises himself as a mechanic, a workman, or an orderly, someone low-ranking but who can also pass through places without notice. Scratches-at-Fleas is not given to vanity and treats nearly everything as a joke, except for the treatment of the homeless and the dispossessed, a subject which will change his manner from humorous to deadly seriousness. But for all of his modesty, Scratches-at-Fleas' reputation has grown among Australia's Garou and inspired many of them to help their weaker brethren rather than shun them or cast them aside. He has even managed to convince sworn enemies to fight side by side on a number of occasions. Number 5. Shakespeare. The Philodox Bone Gnawer known as Shakespeare was born for a stage, though he came into the world under a half-moon outside of the Morton Theater in New York City. He was raised by the streets but also by New York's libraries, theaters, and museums, where by day he would read for hours at a time, and by night listen to symphonies and plays from the darkest corners of closed balconies and catwalks. His wisdom and insight would have made him an excellent stargazer, and the tribe would have taken him if they could, but he was true to his bone gnawer nature. Shakespeare not only spread knowledge among the Garou in the cities he passed through, but took those society considered trash and turned them into his treasure. His modus operandi was to enter a city and then make friends with the tribal elders there. Then he would gather various street people, both human and bone gnawer, and instruct them in theater, its roots, its techniques, and its many uses, both artistic and political. The bone gnawers who joined Shakespeare's ad hoc troops usually converted to the Frankweiler camp after he left. As a Philodox, Shakespeare is an asker of hard questions, a judge of not only men and Garou, but his fellow bone gnawers. For him, it is not enough to simply scavenge. The bone gnawers must take those society has thrown away, clean them, fix them, polish them, and turn them into something greater. Number 4. Carlita Gutierrez. Carlita is a young upstart in the contemporary bone gnawers tribe, almost something of a prodigy. She had her first change before she was even an adolescent, and the end result was a dead family of Cuban squatters in some boarded-up building in Tampa, Florida. Carlita has worked hard to make amends for their deaths, as well as do her part in the impending apocalypse. Several years later, at the age of 15, Carlita, a scrawny young girl in baggy clothes, an old Tampa Bay Buccaneers cap, and a fang dagger sticking out of her belt, is an experienced Philodox. She wants to become a mother in the tribe, or even grandmother, but rather than gain renown as a caretaker or provider, she endeavors to punish the guilty. She is as battle-hardened as Garou twice her age, and has slain both Banes and Black Spiral dancers in the swamps of Florida. On the other side of things, Carlita has served as a mediator between rival septs, such as the Wounded Bay Sept and the Follow North Sept of West Central Florida. By the turn of the 20th century, Carlita served as the right hand of Mother Eldridge, leader of the Bone Gnawers of Tampa, who saw that the girl was both smart and fearless, but needed wisdom to temper some of the heat in her still young blood. For her part, Carlita is often called Big Sis by her allies. It's not an actual title within the tribe, but recognition of her ambition to make it to the top of the Bone Gnawers, and her ability that she might actually be able to pull it off. Number 3. Father Isaac. Isaac was, quite literally, born on the streets. In the 1950s, 2 policemen found a days-old baby in a dumpster in the east end of Vancouver, British Columbia. No parents were ever identified for Isaac, as he was named, and he never used a last name, as it would have been a lie. Isaac spent his entire childhood in orphanages and foster homes, a situation that filled him with near homicidal rage. During one stay in a foster home, he slashed his foster mother's arms with a kitchen knife when she tried to discipline him. Perhaps because of the rage within him, the first change came on him early. The kinfetch who was sent to find him missed the change, and his then foster parents mistook his destructive rampage for just another tantrum. The fact that he had turned into a 7-foot-tall man-wolf was glossed over by the delirium. The police were called, and by the time Isaac changed back, he was in a juvenile detention facility. But this proved a little problem for the Bone Gnawers of Vancouver, who successfully extracted Isaac from custody without any loss of life. Isaac's lack of formal education and the trauma inflicted on him by the foster care system would have turned anyone like him into a wreck of a human. But beneath all of his anger, Isaac was also incredibly intelligent and perceptive. At first, he resisted learning the ways of the Garou, just as he had resisted being controlled by his foster parents and the child care system. But then one day, things fell into place for him. He learned to appreciate his heritage as a Garou, and the Garou's purpose, and their duty. The change in him was nearly instantaneous from a sullen, violent teenager into a respectful and perceptive Bone Gnawer. But the rage was always still there, beneath the surface, at his core. Even as he grew older and became more self-disciplined and wise, Isaac's enemies learned, sometimes the hard way, about the old truism, beware the fury of a patient man. In the 1980s, Isaac became the leader of the Underdogs Sept and earned the title of father within the Bone Gnawers tribe. It was not a position that he sought out, it was just if something needed to be done for the tribe and the Sept, he was typically the first one to go. This was enough to convince his tribe mates to elect him leader and make him their representative on Vancouver's council. But leadership weighed heavily on his shoulders. In every form, he looked about 10 years older than he actually was. Worse still, by the mid-1990s, he had no obvious successor should he meet his death in battle or decide to finally step down. Number 2. Mother Larissa. New York City might be the last place one would look for Garou, much less an entire sept of them. But there is a cairn located in the heart of Central Park, the Sept of the Green, which has passed from the hands of the Wendigo to the Silverfangs and is currently held by the Bone Gnawers. The Sept is led by an elder Bone Gnawer theurge named Mother Larissa. Not much is known about the early Hamid life of Larissa except that she was brought into the tribe from somewhere in upstate New York and has been in the Sept of the Green since the Great Depression, when it came into the Bone Gnawers' possession. The Sept of the Green is a sept of fellowship, which suits Mother Larissa well, since she has spent decades giving charity and support to Garou not only of her own tribe, but of others as well. As it presently stands, Larissa is the last surviving pupil of the original Central Park Bone Gnawers. Under her leadership, all are welcome in the Sept of the Green. This hospitality has, occasionally, extended to mages, changelings, and even the odd vampire who was able to behave itself. Other Garou have warned her against what they perceive to be a weakness in her charity, and possibly jeopardizing the strongest cairn in New York. But Mother Larissa has proven more than adept at warding off both invasion and treachery, sometimes from within her own tribe. More importantly, she has demonstrated that she is willing to pay the price herself when her compassion is met with ingratitude. To her own people, Mother Larissa is a wise and perceptive counselor. To outsiders, she plays the role of a dirty, crazed bag lady with a little bit of witch mixed in for spice. Her persona is based, in part, on a comic book character that appeared in the 1950s called The House of the Dying, containing various urban horror stories. She receives visitors on a hidden island in a lake in Central Park, where she can be found stirring a black iron cauldron full of foul-smelling, unidentifiable brew. The stuff is genuinely harmless, but she offers it to people seeking sanctuary, a test of their willingness to trust her. During her long life, she has gathered a library of stories about the supernatural, which she will gleefully share with any cub who cares to listen. But Mother Larissa has been around a long time and isn't getting any younger, and her theurgic rights can only maintain her body for so much longer. As of the late 1990s, Larissa has been unwilling, or perhaps unable, to leave Central Park, where her magic is the strongest. But even if Mother Larissa doesn't leave the park, she has enough respect and power that she can make her will felt throughout the entire city of New York if need be. Some of the New York Bone Gnawers joke that Mother Larissa will be ruling the Sept of the Green until the apocalypse comes. Number 1. Jack Debiltongue. One of the most famous Bone Gnawers in the tribe's history was Jack Debiltongue. Jack lived in England in the 13th and 14th centuries, during the reign of King Edward I of House Plantagenet, also known as Edward Longshanks. Jack Debiltongue rose to prominence when King Edward commanded Peter Corbett, Baron of Cowes, to hunt down the wolves of England, many of which were kin to the Silverfangs and the Get of Fenris. Jack Debiltongue, also known as Jack Almsman and Jack Ailman, was a drunk, a beggar, a gambler, a lecher, and a snoop, but he was also the cleverest bone gnawer to ever live. Garou who sought sanctuary in London were given shelter by the Bone Gnawers at Jack's insistence. Baron Corbett followed soon after, where he was aided by the Court of Avalon, which, at the time, was led by the Cappadocian Lord Camden, seneschal of Prince Mithras, who was on one of his many sojourns to satisfy his insatiable wanderlust. King Edward, along with Sheriff John Howard, joined Corbett in the hunt for shape-changers in the shadows of London. One evening, they came across a ragged beggar stumbling along the Thames. Jack Debiltongue bowed low to the tall king and told Edward of a plot against him by a pair of French chevaliers to kidnap the king and deliver him alive to the Scottish rebel William Wallace. Jack, with his network of beggars and spies, had told the truth of it. The two chevaliers were captured at an inn and later confessed to the plot. Edward's queen, Eleanor of Castile, urged him to find Jack again and repay him for what he had done. When the king managed to locate Jack, he told Jack to name a gift that the Bone Gnawer would have. Jack asked that the king stop Baron Corbett's wolf hunt, and then added, with a sly grin, that if the king desired wolf pelts, Jack would give them, in the near future. Edward Longshanks was true to his word, and the wolves of England were safe during his reign. The Get of Fenris grumbled about Jack Debiltongue, because spying and plotting was simply not their way, and sneered behind his back that he was the king's dog, but they could do nothing because in London, Jack ruled the city's Garou. After Jack had saved King Edward, his old friend, Bob Bleachbone, came to him and told him about some ruffians who made sport of beating London's poor, regardless of whether they were man, woman, or child. Jack and his pack came upon the ruffians one night and tore them to pieces, then tossed their remains into the Thames. For his actions, London's poor made sure that Jack never again wanted for food, drink, or women. Sometime later, Philippe de Valence, the Silverfang King of France, was betrothed to Lady Constance of York, one of the great beauties of the old Norman aristocracy and kinfolk to the Silverfangs. Philippe made plans to wed in London, and commanded Jack to bring his betrothed to him from the far north of the country. As Jack and his pack rode north, disguised as soldiers, they saw the handiwork of Baron Corbett, and recognized another's hand behind it. As Jack traveled south with Lady Constance, with his pack covering their journey, his desire for her grew. She would sing to him, and he would teach her dice games and bawdy jokes. By the time they arrived in London, Jack was reluctant to give her up to Philippe, but he knew what would happen if he waged war against the Silverfangs. So he escorted the bride to the chapel, and watched as the woman he loved married the lord to which he had been promised. But later, at the banquet, Jack whispered to a friend of his, John Muttontheft, to keep Philip's wine cup full, and to make sure that it was the strongest wine he could lay his hands on. And Philippe obliged by getting good and drunk. He broke out into song, a slurring and overly long ballad of courtly love. When he finished, he asked Jack what he thought of his art. Jack responded by lifting his leg and farting. The hall of French Garou and nobles fell into a stunned silence. Jack broke the awkwardness by explaining that, in England, it was customary to express one's gratitude by breaking wind. After Philippe had passed out drunk, Jack crept up the stairs to where Constance awaited her lord and husband. By the time Philip awoke from his stupor, Jack leapt out of a window in lupus form. Constance explained to Philippe that she and Jack had already worn out the bed. A day later, the proud Get of Fenris of the Midlands came to the Bone Gnawers of London to ally with them against the black spiral dancers creeping down from Scotland, who were led by a powerful warrior called Dread-Doom the Mighty. The Get wanted open and glorious battle, but Jack Debiltongue had a different strategy in mind. In secret, Jack approached the Black Spiral Dancers and offered them an alliance to drive the Get of Fenris and the Silverfangs out of England. Then, he proposed, the Black Spiral Dancers would have free reign of the countryside, but they would leave London to the Bone Gnawers. But Dread-Doom was not easily fooled. He accused Jack of lying and told the beggar wolf that he knew it was Jack who had brought Philippe's bride to him from York. Jack replied that it was for love of Constance that he sought this devil's bargain, and that with Philippe dead, he would claim Constance for his own. Dread-Doom laughed at this, and the bargain was struck, on the condition that Jack and his pack descend into Dread-Doom's hive to partake of the Black Spiral Dancers' horrific rites that very evening. Jack agreed, but the Bone Gnawers used rites to blind them to the worst of the Black Spiral Dancers' horrors and deafen them to the screams that were music to the ears of the Worm's servants. The next night, the Bone Gnawers and the Black Spiral Dancers ran together. Jack offered to lead them, by secret way, into London, and he led them into a hidden vale, where the Black Spiral Dancers were ambushed by the combined forces of the Get of Fenris and the Silverfangs. Then, the Bone Gnawers turned on the Black Spiral Dancers. Dread-Doom flew into a fury and attacked Jack. By sheer luck, Jack avoided being slain by Dread-Doom's wormish gifts, and bit down on the Dancer Lord's neck until he died. Dread-Doom's last words were, "Jack Debiltongue, Debiltongue, you are named true." Jack then made peace with Philippe, allowing him to take the lion's share of the glory for the defeat of the Black Spiral Dancers, but Jack would keep the pelts for his own use. These he gave to King Edward in fulfillment of his earlier promise, and told the king that the rabid wolves were all dead, for which he once again enjoyed Edward's gratitude. And so ends the tale of Jack Debiltongue, defender of poor and kinfolk alike, who served one king, humiliated another, and slew a champion of the worm. Jack Debiltongue, the Beggar-King of London. And those were the top 10 werewolves of the Bone Gnawers tribe. Werewolf was never really my game, but I always kind of liked the Bone Gnawers' perspective on things. They may be poor, they may be downtrodden, and they may even be despised in some situations, but they adapt to the changing conditions and achieve victory. They have a very pragmatic attitude about this cosmic war against the metaphysical aspect of corruption and destruction, and that attitude is that you use every tool you have on hand to win the fight. They take care of the people to the left and right of them, and even those above and below them. If they win, everyone will call them heroes, not that it matters too much. But if they lose, they'll all be dead and it won't matter anyway. But one tribe who doesn't share in the get-dirty mindset of the Bone Gnawers is the Children of Gaia, the peacemakers of the Garou nation, and the next tribe on the list for a top 10 video. Until next time.